Hey guys, welcome back to my channel. So today I'm not doing a Friday 5 because I got a lot of requests to do a review of this new palette right here, and this is the Goddess palette from Alter Ego. It just launched yesterday. It's $16 on their website, and I also have a coupon code to save you 10% off, so it brings the price down to $14.40. They're also offering free shipping over $25, so they have a second palette, the Temptress, which is a dupe for the Anastasia Sultry palette. So if you don't have that one already, you can get them both and get free shipping, or if you just want to buy a second one of these for a friend, there's always that option as well. So this one here is a dupe for the Natasha Denona Gold palette. So that one came out back in the fall, and it was the one that I was the most interested in. I had never owned one of her palettes and never wanted to spend $129 on one until I saw that, because it was so beautiful. It's just full of neutrals. You have your bronzes, your golds, browns, and then a couple pops of teal, and I just felt like it was so super wearable. And I did end up splurging on it during the Sephora sale, which I told myself I was never going to do. But for those of you who wanted it and didn't want to spend the money, you were very smart. This palette is now available, and it's a shade for shade match. So I'm going to be showing you some swatches, some live swatches, as well as a look that I created today. I have the Natasha Denona on one side and the Goddess palette on the other. And to be honest with you, I cannot tell the difference between my eyes at all. I would never think that one of them was $100 more than the other. So anyway, let's go ahead and just jump right into it. So this palette has 15 shades, exactly like the gold palette. The shades are arranged in a different order though. So when I was doing swatches, it was a little tough for me to match them up just because a lot of the browns, especially in these two palettes, are very similar. Same with the golds. There are just very subtle differences between them. And also there are some varying finishes in this palette. You have matte shades. You also have some more metallic shades, and then some regular shimmer shades as well. So I'll definitely get into the different formulas that are in these palettes when I do the swatches. But first I want to go ahead and do the eye comparison and show you what I did with my eye look. So first I'm starting with the Goddess palette, and for my crease I'm using the shade Hera, which is a light matte brown. And I found that the Goddess palette picked up very easily on my brush. It blended very, very easily on my eyes. I noticed a tiny bit of powder kick up, but nothing too dramatic. And then on the Natasha Denona side, I'm using the shade Aria, which is basically the same shade. One thing I noticed about this one though is that it's a little bit more pigmented going on. Now that can be good and bad. Usually when it comes to matte shades, I prefer them to be a little bit more sheer and blendable and buildable, because really pigmented eyeshadows can sometimes take longer to blend out. And that was definitely what I found with this one. I had to spend a little bit more time blending on this side of my eye than I did with the Goddess palette. So that's just kind of a personal preference thing. I think if you love a really strongly pigmented matte eyeshadow, the Natasha Denona one, it definitely has it. But the Goddess palette, for a lot less money, you could always just add another layer and build it up and get the exact same color. So again, it's really just what you prefer. Okay, so moving on the Goddess side, I'm using the really deep turquoise matte shade Gaia, that one in my outer corner, and it was so super pigmented. Again, it picked up very, very easily with my brush and blended out really easily on my eye. I didn't have any issues with this being patchy, which is pretty rare for a really deep shade like this, especially a bluish green. So I was very impressed with how this one applied. And then on the Natasha Denona side, I applied the shade Python, which is also a deep turquoise, and this one was a little bit difficult to pick up with my brush. It actually was very hard. I had to dig into it quite a bit. It's very firmly pressed into the pan. It didn't have a lot of fallout, while the one on the Goddess side had just like a tiny little bit, but I just tapped off my brush and it wasn't an issue. But with this one, there was zero fallout. It just didn't go on quite as pigmented as the other side did. But I also didn't have any issues blending this one out, so that's a good thing. And then for my lid, I picked up the shade Luna from the Goddess palette. This one is just a beautiful shiny gold, and I picked it up with a brush at first just to see how it applied, and I was really impressed with how strongly it went on with a brush. Sometimes with shimmer shades, you have to wet the brush or apply them with your finger, and I got pretty good pigmentation with it just using the brush alone. But then I went in and grabbed some with my finger and applied that on top, and it really intensified it a lot. So I think this one performs slightly better with a finger, but I still don't think it was that bad with the brush. And then for the gold palette side, I picked up the shade Aurum, and this one also picked up really nicely with a brush. It has a very similar texture to the one in the Goddess palette, so I found these to be pretty comparable as I was putting them on my eyes. And then just to keep things even on both sides, since they seem to be applying the same way, I dipped my finger into this shade and then applied a little bit more on top just to intensify it. And I also blended it back toward that turquoise shade a little bit. And then the last thing I did was take a flat liner brush and dip back into that deep turquoise shade and lined underneath my eyes with it. I just created a really, really skinny line just to connect my lower lash line with my upper lash line. And then I added 2 coats of the new Flower Beauty Warrior Princess mascara, and here's the final look. I think it came out beautiful. I honestly cannot tell from both sides which one is which. They look pretty much identical, and I think even though the formulas were very different, just tweaking the way that I applied things a little bit made it so that they look the same in the end. So I can honestly say that you can get the same look with both palettes, just depending on how you work with the shadows. All right, so now let's go ahead and get into some live swatches, and then I'm just gonna go row by row and talk about the formulas a little bit. Okay, so starting with the top row, we saw that the matte Natasha Denona shades definitely went on more pigmented, but at the same time, I prefer a less pigmented matte eyeshadow just because I find them easier to blend on my eyes, but it's just something to keep in mind if you're considering either one of these palettes, that the Goddess one definitely has to be built up a little bit to get to the same exact color as the Natasha Denona, because you might have seen that some of the colors didn't look exactly the same, but if you build up the Goddess ones, they do end up looking identical. It's just a matter of building them a little bit. And then as far as the shimmer shades in the top row, there are 2 different finishes going on. The shimmery turquoise and then the gold at the end are more of like a regular pressed shimmer shade. They're very, very smooth, super pigmented going on. But the lighter gold shade in the center is more of like a crumbly, flaky texture. So it's more of a metallic shadow. And this is the type that I would highly recommend using a glitter glue or wetting your brush before you apply it to your eyes, or you're gonna get a ton of fallout. In the Natasha Denona palette, that same shade is very firmly pressed into the pan. It doesn't have any of the fallout at all, so that's just one thing that I noted as a difference between the two, but otherwise, the regular pressed shimmers in both palettes swatched pretty similarly. Okay, so then in row 2, we had basically the same exact setup. We had 2 regular pressed shimmer shades on the ends, which again swatched almost identically to the Natasha Denona ones. We also had 2 matte shades, which I actually found that the deep turquoise in the Goddess palette swatched way better than the one in the gold palette. And I also noticed the same thing as I was applying that same shade to the outer corner of my eyes. The one in the gold palette is super firmly pressed and really difficult to pick up either with a brush or a finger. So I definitely prefer the one in the Goddess palette, even though it has a little bit more powder kick up. And then the shade in the center I actually found is the one shade in both of these palettes that is not the same. The one in the Natasha Denona palette is called Brass, and it has a little bit of green to it, whereas the one in the Goddess palette, Valkyrie, is a little bit more of a shiny gold. And that shadow also has that very flaky texture, so it's a little bit more crumbly. And actually in the Natasha Denona palette, that one also has a slightly flaky texture, not as much as the one in the Goddess palette, but it is a little different than her other shimmer shades. So that's just something to keep in mind as well, that that shade is not identical. And then in the last row, we have 2 more of those flakier shades in the Goddess palette, the white shade called Freya and then Cassandra on the end. Those ones, again, just have that really crumbly texture to them, whereas in the Natasha Denona palette, they don't have that, but they're a little harder to pick up. So again, it kind of depends on your preference here, because I think the ones in the Goddess palette, you would need to pick up with either your finger or wet your brush to get them to stick a little bit better. And the ones in the gold palette, I find that you really have to dig in hard with your brush or a finger just to pick them up. So I'm kind of noticing a theme here where the mattes in the gold palette are more pigmented than than the Goddess, but harder to blend out. And the metallic shades in the gold palette are harder to pick up than the Goddess one, but the Goddess one has a little bit more fallout. And really the only shadows between these two palettes that are really similar are the regular pressed shimmer shades, which there are only a couple of. So when it comes right down to it, it's definitely going to depend on your preference for formula as far as the eyeshadows go. But anyway, what I'm going to do now is go about the rest of my day. I want to do a wear test and see if the Goddess palette and the gold palette hold up for the same amount of time on my eyes. So I will do a check-in a little bit later and let you know my final thoughts. Hey guys, it's about 7:30 p.m. I'm already in my PJs, but I just wanted to do my check-in and also give you my final thoughts. So just looking at my eyes, I mean, they pretty much look identical. Both of them kind of smudged a little bit underneath, but other than that, I mean, they look pretty good on both sides. This was the Alter Ego Goddess side, and this one was Natasha Denona Gold. So I'm impressed, definitely, and I knew I would be because I loved the Alter Ego Temptress palette that came out. When I did the comparison with the Anastasia Sultry, I felt like they were really similar and also both really long lasting. So like I said before, the matte shades in the Goddess palette do take a little bit of building to get them to that level of intensity of the Natasha Denona, but I mean, is it honestly worth spending $129 on that palette? No. Maybe if it was like 40, like kind of in the mid-range price range, I would say maybe then if you like a little bit more pigmentation. But to be honest with you, I prefer the buildable mattes, like I said, and I also like shimmer shades that are easier to pick up. And even if they're a little bit crumbly or have a little bit of fallout, I still prefer that to the Natasha Denona ones that are so firmly pressed into the pan that I have to like dig and dig and dig. So for me, I just prefer the formula of the Goddess palette a lot more. I just think it's way more user-friendly. I think maybe the gold palette and all of the Natasha palettes are sort of geared more towards like professional makeup artists and people who really know what they're doing. I don't, so you know, I just like something a little bit more user-friendly, and I think the Goddess palette definitely is. And as you can see, you can still get the exact same look with it. You just have to apply it a little bit differently, but it's not really a big deal at all. I mean, it's an amazing price. It's only $14.40 with my code, so I mean, you honestly cannot beat that to get the same exact shades that are in the gold palette. So anyway, guys, I hope you enjoyed this comparison and found it helpful. If you did, don't forget to hit the thumbs up button, and also let me know down in the comments below what your thoughts are. Did you pick up the Goddess palette yet? Have you tried the Temptress before that? I would love to hear your thoughts. Thank you all so much for watching. Please don't forget to hit the subscribe button before you leave, and I'll see you in my next video. Bye!